What I'm about to show you is a pattern that's been hidden in plain sight for decades. And when you see it, you're going to understand why some of the smartest economists and historians are quietly sounding alarm bells right now, because this isn't theory, this isn't speculation, this is a documented 7-step collapse pattern that destroyed one of the most powerful empires in modern history. And every single one of these steps is happening in America. Right now, as we speak, step 1 is economic stagnation masked by false prosperity. And this is where things get really interesting. Because on the surface, everything looks fine. The Soviet Union in the 1980s looked stable. They had massive military power. They had nuclear weapons. They controlled half of Europe. But underneath the surface, their economy had stopped growing decades earlier. And here's the key. They hid it by manipulating statistics, by borrowing heavily, and by depleting their energy reserves to generate short-term revenue. And if you look at America today, we're seeing the exact same pattern. GDP growth has been declining for decades. When you strip out financial engineering and debt-fueled consumption, real productive growth has been stagnant since the 2000s. And just like the Soviets, we're masking it with printed money, with asset bubbles, and with statistical manipulation. Step 2 is the resource dependency trap. And this is critical because the Soviet economy became entirely dependent on oil and natural gas exports. When oil prices were high in the 1970s, they used that revenue to subsidize everything, to import food, to maintain their military, to keep the population docile. But when oil prices collapsed, from $120 a barrel in 1980 to $24 in 1986, their entire economic model imploded overnight. And here's what nobody wants to talk about. America has become dangerously dependent on the dollar's reserve currency status, which is our version of Soviet oil. We print dollars, the world accepts them, and we import real goods in exchange. But the moment the world stops accepting dollars at current rates, our standard of living collapses, just like the Soviets when oil prices fell. Step 3 is the explosion of unfunded liabilities. And this is where the math becomes impossible to ignore. The Soviet Union had promised their people guaranteed employment, guaranteed housing, guaranteed healthcare, guaranteed pensions, and they had no way to pay for any of it because their economy was not productive enough to generate the revenue needed. And instead of admitting this, they just kept printing rubles and making the promises bigger until the whole system collapsed under its own weight. And look at America. Right now, we have unfunded liabilities in Social Security and Medicare alone that exceed $75 trillion. The Congressional Budget Office just released a report saying federal debt is going to hit 120% of GDP by 2035, and debt service payments are already consuming $1 trillion per year, which is more than we spend on defense. Step 4 is the loss of fiscal control, and this is the point of no return. Because once a government loses the ability to control its budget, the spiral accelerates exponentially. The Soviet Union reached this point in the mid-1980s when Gorbachev tried to reform the economy with perestroika, but the reforms only made things worse because they exposed how broken everything really was. They lifted some price controls, which caused immediate inflation. They allowed some private enterprise, which showed how inefficient the state sector was, and they tried to reduce military spending, but that collapsed their industrial base. And here's the parallel. The United States government has completely lost fiscal discipline. We just passed a tax and spending bill that adds $3 trillion to the deficit over 10 years. We're borrowing $43.5 billion per week. And both political parties have given up even pretending to care about balanced budgets because the math is so far gone that there's no politically viable way to fix it. Step 5 is the credibility collapse. And this happens when the population stops believing in the system, its ability to deliver on its promises. Soviet citizens started hoarding goods in the late 1980s because they knew the ruble was becoming worthless. They knew store shelves would be empty. They knew their pensions wouldn't be worth anything. And this psychology shift from trust to distrust is what accelerates everything. Because once people lose faith, they change their behavior, and that behavior change makes the crisis self-fulfilling. And we're watching this happen in America right now. Consumer confidence is collapsing. Despite strong headline employment numbers, credit card delinquencies are rising. People are depleting their savings. Household debt is at record levels. And most importantly, young people don't believe they'll ever retire comfortably or own homes or have the standard of living their parents had. Step 6 is the legitimacy crisis of institutions. And this is the step that makes collapse inevitable because economic problems can be managed if institutions are strong and trusted. But when institutions lose legitimacy, the entire social contract breaks down in the Soviet Union. This happened when the Communist Party lost its ability to command obedience, when regional republics started ignoring Moscow's orders, when the military refused to crack down on protesters, and when the entire apparatus of state control simply dissolved because nobody believed in it anymore. And you can see the exact same pattern emerging in America. Trust in Congress is at all-time lows. Trust in the media has collapsed. Trust in the judiciary is partisan. Trust in the Federal Reserve is being openly questioned. And when Trump attacks the Fed is independence, when states threaten to ignore federal law, when half the country believes elections are rigged, you're watching the legitimacy of institutions evaporate in real time. Step 7 is the cascade failure, and this is the final step, where everything unravels faster than anyone thought possible, because each failing system takes down the next one in the Soviet Union. It took less than 2 years from the first cracks appearing to complete dissolution. The Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, and by December 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. And it wasn't a war that ended it. It ain't a revolution. It was just Aussie Tong that stopped functioning, because too many people stopped participating. The miners went on strike and weren't punished, so everyone else stopped working. The republics declared independence, and Moscow couldn't stop them. The currency became worthless, and people switched to barter, and once that cascade started, there was no way to stop it. Now here's what makes this pattern so dangerous. When you're inside it, you can't see it, because each step feels manageable. Each step has explanations and excuses and people telling you it's different. This time, the Soviets didn't think they were collapsing in 1988. They thought they were reforming American economists today. Don't think we're collapsing. They think we're managing challenges. But the pattern is identical, and the outcome tends to be the same, because the mathematics of unsustainable systems don't care about intentions or optimism. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget just released a report warning that the United States could experience 6 different types of fiscal crisis. A financial crisis, where interest rates spike and banks fail. An inflation crisis, where the currency loses value rapidly. An austerity crisis, where the government is forced to slash spending. A currency crisis, where the dollar loses reserve status. A default crisis, where we can't pay our debts. Or a gradual crisis, where living standards slowly erode. And any one of these could trigger the others, creating a cascade exactly like what happened to the Soviet Union. And here's the really terrifying part. The people who see this pattern are the ones quietly moving their wealth into hard assets. Gold and silver are breaking out to all-time highs because central banks and billionaires are diversifying away from dollar-denominated assets. They're not doing this because they're pessimistic. They're doing it because they understand history, and they know that when reserve currencies fail, when empires collapse, when unsustainable systems reach their breaking point, it happens faster than anyone expects. The Soviet Union went from superpower to dissolved in 36 months. America, as debt to GDP, just hit 100%. For the first time since World War II, our deficit is 6% of GDP, and growing our interest payments exceed our defense budget. Our political system is paralyzed, our institutions are losing legitimacy, and our population is losing faith in the future. And every single one of these factors mirrors the Soviet collapse pattern. So the question is not whether this pattern is real. The question is whether we're far enough along that it is inevitable, or whether there's still time to change course, and based on the current trajectory, based on the political paralysis, based on the mathematical impossibility of the debt burden. It is looking more and more like we're past the point of no return. And that means the next few years are going to be unlike anything most Americans have experienced in their lifetimes. Because when systems this large fail, they don't fail slowly, they fail all at once.